Welcome to a Bible Talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church.
My name is Sophie, and I'm going to be doing the Bible Talk reading for tonight from Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 to 24, which can be found on page 214 of the Church Bibles. Then Joshua son of Nun secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go, look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." "Our lives for your lives," the men assured her. "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." Now the men had said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us, unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days, until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us."
Evening, evening, evening. Hello, everyone. Sorry, you only have to reply once to that, which is good. So how was your Anzac Day? Let's have a bit of a show of hands here. Who has relatives who have served in the Australian or New Zealand Army, Air Force or Navy? Have a look around. That's pretty good. That's very honourable state of affairs in lots of ways. My grandfather served in all sorts of theatres of war. That's the reason why Anzac Day is so important, because we enjoy the freedoms that our forefathers in many ways fought for us. We had a wonderful Anzac Day service today. Air Commodore, who is here. Yes, you are. Kevin, that is Kevin, isn't it? here in Mufti tonight, our Air Commodore, Archdeacon for the Air Force, preached this morning at a wonderful gathering. It was wonderful to be able to join together and recognise that. How about we pray as we get into this? If you don't have a Bible, then make sure you grab one from the back, and we have that in front of us as we go. Let me pray. Dear Lord and Father, on a day when two nations are brought together as one through the sacrifice of many, we look at a passage that shows us how all nations are brought together through the sacrifice of one. Thank you for the good news that we have of Jesus, which extends to all people of every nation, of every walk of life. Amen. A few years ago, Rowan Atkinson played an idiotic spy in a series of Johnny English movies. Who's seen any of these? There's 3 of them. Look at that. There's even more people have seen these ones. Mr. Bean meets Blackadder somewhere in the middle, and we end up with some version of a James Bond guy. Well, he bumbles through one humorous misadventure into another, making an absolute fool of himself until somehow managing to pull it all back together again and win the day. He's not a very good spy. Very good actor, very good comedian, not a very good spy. Well, today we look at Joshua 2, which was read for us, and we meet 2 inept spies. Yet despite their shortcomings, they manage to give us a picture of just how far and how wide the promises of God extend. I hope you will look into this passage and be willing to do some work with me tonight. Joshua chapter 2. The people of God are on the verge of entering into the land. Finally, this is the land that was promised to them many generations before, and the land that they had been walking towards for 40 years. A land that they knew was flowing with milk and honey. They knew that because 40 years before, Moses had sent 12 men to spy out the land. Numbers 13 and 14 tells you about that. Now, the report came back of a powerful people with large and fortified cities, and the people of Israel melted in fear, all except Joshua and Caleb. Moses has now died, and as we get into this book of Joshua, the installed leader is Joshua. And so to prepare to take the land, he sends 2 spies to look over the land, as verse 1 tells you. Now, this raises a question for some straight away. If God has promised to give the land, then why do you need to send spies into it? Isn't this a sure thing? If it's the God of all that's all powerful and the rest of it, can't he just, you don't need spies to go and check out the land because he's already promised to it. So don't waste your time doing that. Does this mean that Joshua, in sending the spies, doesn't trust God? Not at all. In faith, we are called to trust God that he will do what he has promised. That doesn't mean that we know how it will play out. Joshua knows that the land will be theirs, but he doesn't know how that will come about. So in faithful wisdom, he sends spies, just like Moses did, to check out the land. Now, trusting God means walking each step day by day in faith. Now, if you think about it, every one of those steps that we take, we do not know what it will look like until we take that step. That is faith. You don't need to know what it is and the outcome of that before you take the step. That would be called knowledge. To step out in faith is to take that step knowing that you are putting your life or your trust in whatever it is that is to come. And as we have seen abundantly in many different contexts, we take each step day by day, not necessarily knowing what's coming. But we allow God to prepare each step even if we might not know what that step will bring. Now, the contrast between what happened for Israel under Moses compared to what happens here in Joshua shows that there is a reverse outcome. So if you were to go back and see what Moses did when he sent those 12 spies into this very same land, under Moses, God said, wait, I don't want you to go into the land. And now, under Joshua, the spies go into that very same land, and what does God say? Now is the time, go. Both leaders trust God. The outcome will ultimately be the same, but the way that that comes about is different. Let's have a look at the passage before us. Our spies are not very good at being spies. They enter Jericho, they go into the house of a prostitute named Rahab. Now, if the spies are supposed to be discreet, they have clearly failed, because even the king of Jericho is told that they've come and their cover is blown. I would have thought that being a spy is supposed to be kept undercover in some way so that people don't know that you're there. They know quite clearly these spies are there. The men are dispatched to find them, and it is Rahab who comes up with the plan. She hides the men on her roof, and then she sends the king's men on a wild goose chase, which sees them leave the city, closing the gates behind them. Our spies are now trapped inside the city, needing again Rahab to plan their escape. The result is that our inept spies flee the city, and they manage to bring a positive report back to Joshua, despite the fact that they have done very little spying. They have scouted no part of the land except perhaps the interior of one house on the outskirts of the town. I can only imagine the expression on Joshua's face at the very end of this chapter when they get to him and they tell him everything that they've discovered. Really? And you discovered that how? But the text doesn't actually give us much more there, so let's not worry too much on that. Johnny English, eat your heart out. I think I can see where Rowan Atkinson gets his material from. Let's take a closer look at Rahab and at the next section from verses 8 to 14. The text calls her a prostitute. Now, some have called her an innkeeper, perhaps to make her a little more palatable. But there's no need to do that. She is a woman of the night. She's a harlot. She is making a living in a way that is offensive to God, as stated under the Israelite law. She is a pagan. She's living in a pagan city. There is no indication that she has any family background that would have brought her up in a knowledge of God. If you were to write a list of people who were probable evangelistic contacts, people you think, well, if I was to explain the gospel to them, then it's more likely than they'd probably, become a Christian, because they're the type of person who would probably accept that. Then Rahab would not have been on that list. With the background that she has, this is the person you think, no, this is a lost cause. She is a lost cause. Yet in this chapter, she gives a confession and a declaration about the sovereignty and power of God that is second only to Joshua himself in the very last chapter when he's on his deathbed. Rahab is worth paying attention to. Now, we can be quite reductionistic in the way that we think. Let me see if I can explain that a little bit. When we talk about the power of what is possible, our frame of reference is usually limited to what we think is possible. We accept norms. We often push back, if anything, asks us to accept something that is not normal, so to speak. And in doing so, we actually reduce what is possible to what we think is possible, rather than to what is possible under God. One of the interesting things as you work your way through the Bible is that humanly speaking, we reduce God down to something that we want to be plausible or possible, that fits within our frame of reference. And yet, time and time again in the Bible, it blows our mind or blows the parameters out, as what is possible for God is so much bigger than what we allow it to be. And so we can be quite reductionistic in the way that we think. Let me see if I can give you an example. Have you ever fallen into the trap that I've often fallen into? Have you ever written a person off in faith? They would never believe. They're too hardened to God. As if their salvation is dependent on me thinking it's possible. How about I flip that round the other way? If you were not someone who believed, have you ever written yourself off? I could never have a faith like that. And then point to somebody who seems to be super spiritual. I have a friend who I remember having the conversation with him as I was trying to say to him, Jesus is someone that is worth paying attention to. Jesus came to save sinners. He wasn't as interested in the saints. And the reply was, yes, I know, that's wonderful. I would absolutely love to have that faith, but I could never have that faith because nobody would ever accept me. As if your salvation is dependent upon you being acceptable. Sometimes we can be very reductionistic in what is possible. Rahab is a shining example of how inclusive God can be. Now, my, don't we like that word at the moment? We love it to be inclusive. And Rahab is a shining example of that, and it is in the Bible 3,000 years ago. You want an idea? That's where you're going to get the idea from. This passage makes no attempt to condemn Rahab for her profession as a prostitute, as it also makes no comment about the fact that the spies went to visit her. And it doesn't focus on the lie that she tells to send the king's men in the opposite direction. Now, that doesn't make her prostitution or her lying acceptable, but the focus of this chapter is not to highlight that particular issue. The focus of this passage is to show how the promises of God can and they do extend beyond the people of Israel, to people of all backgrounds and to people of all pasts. Why? Because God makes and God keeps his promises. Quite a few of you have been doing School of Ministry here, which I'm really thrilled about. Some of you have been working through the Creation and New Creation unit last year, or Introduction to the Bible, and it looks at the promises of God. So here's a question for you. What would be a key passage that talks about those promises, that introduces those promises of God to us first up? Shout it out. What would be one of those? Genesis 12, 1-3. Genesis 12, was that the through? Great passage. Here it is on the screen. When God first gave Abraham his promise of a new land, it came with the promise that Abraham's descendants would be a blessing to all of the peoples of the earth. That very first promise, into that promise, was the idea that all of the peoples of the earth would enjoy a blessing of being known as the people of God, or with the people of God. And time again in Scripture, we see how those promises extend to those who are outside, to foreigners, to be inclusive. Rahab is the first of many. Now let's look at what motivates her. Verse 9. In explaining her actions, she says something about God and she says something about people. I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear. Now, you will remember when the spies under Moses inspected the land, it was Israel who melted in fear at the seemingly impenetrable strength of Jericho and the surrounding regions. Well, now the pendulum has swung completely the other way, and it is the people of Jericho now who are melting in fear. Why? Verse 10. Because they've heard. Because the message is out, the rumor is out there. There is a storm coming. They have heard about the great works that God has done, drying up the water of the Red Sea so that Israel could pass on dry land, defeating Egypt, that massive superpower of the day with unexplained plagues, and being able to then flee out of their slavery into the freedom that they're about to enjoy. Overthrowing the east kings of Sihon and Og, which were just over the river from them. It's almost, well, you know what it's like when a storm is brewing. We've experienced that more recently with the fires and the rain bombs. The reports start to flow in, and the destruction and the chaos that it's caused starts to come to our ears, and you watch and you dread as it comes closer and closer to the direction to where you are. And you think, is this going to affect, is this going to hit us? That is fearful. The people of Jericho have heard of the great works that God has done to save his people. They've heard of his power and might. They can see that they are headed right towards them. And in verse 11, Rahab says, they heard, their hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is the God in heaven above and on the earth below. And your God is now on our doorstep, and we know where you're going. Now, it tells you something when a foreigner credits the God of Israel and calls him the God of the heavens and the God of the earth. When someone like that is going to explain God in those types of terms, you get an idea of how encompassing this is. When it comes to acknowledging God, Rahab is an example of someone who can look at her world. She can look at what she values. And then she can look at God. And she can look at what he can do and decide. Whose side do I want to be on? We all have that choice. We can look at what is there and think, what is it that I value? What is it that this God values? Which side do I want to be on? And she pleads with the spies, verse 12. Swear to me by that same Lord that you will show kindness to me and my family. She wants a sure sign that she also will be saved from death. And although it seems just a little bit over the pay grade of these spies, verse 14, the spies then assure her that she will be safe when the Lord gives them the land. Why pay attention to Rahab? You know, we live so many years after her. Why pay attention to Rahab? Well, if you were to think just in New Testament terms, she's a Gentile. And unless you're Jewish, that means that you are a foreigner like her. We have an invested interest in her because we too are foreigners in the context of the way the Bible unfolds. If the promises of God could extend to her, then it's possible that it could extend to us as well. But what about in worldly terms? What about in the ways that we think and trade, in the way that we respond to things? In worldly terms, Rahab Well, she has a lot to be worried about. For the way that she lived her life would raise many questions. Her guilt before God was great. If you'll permit me, friends, we are no different. We each live our lives at points in questionable ways. If we're being honest with ourselves, there are times when we live our lives in questionable ways. Perhaps we also fall down sexually or struggle to speak truthfully, to pick on two of the things that we see Rahab having to deal with. Maybe there are other vices that would raise eyebrows in the court of heaven. Greed, excessive alcohol, pride, temper, ambition, self-centeredness. Our guilt before God is great. I'm not meaning to be a wet blanket here. I'm not trying to make us feel guilty in that sense. I'm trying to be realistic. We, in some ways, are no different because our guilt, like Rahab's guilt, is great. And if the salvation of God can be extended to her, it is possible that it can be extended to us as well. This portrait of Rahab is clearly not aiming to paint her as a tragic lost cause. In fact, the opposite. It shows Rahab to be valued and included. And friends, if you want to be valued and included, there is no reason why this shouldn't speak to you as well. Let's go back to the passage from verse 15 to 24. She lets the spies down by a rope through the window. Now, if you read it as it sort of plays out, you've got to imagine this scene. Perhaps on the way down, they suddenly realise, hold on, we haven't actually come up with a plan here, what to do next. How does this contract work? And you can imagine them sitting there on the abseiling things as they're going down. Hold on a moment, how are you going to know what's going on later? Oh, we've got an idea. Here's a scarlet cord. Can I take the scarlet cord and stick this out your window? And then when we come back later on and we decide to completely take over Jericho, just make sure that scarlet cord... Have you got the cord? Yep, great, that's good. Stick it out the window so that when we come back later on. And then she sort of goes on a little bit more. Now, what you need to do now is you need to go running this particular direction and do it for these many days. It looks like a bit of a comedy act, as if they're trying to work it out as they go. The point, the contract, the pact. Rahab obeys and the spies get away. And eventually they make it back to Joshua with the report. The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands, and all of the people are melting in fear because of us. Verse 24. So think about that. Based on the report of two inept spies who have been in one house on the outskirts of the city, and they are listening to one prostitute, they have now returned back to the leader of the entire Israelite army and has said, this is the report of the land. And it's in chapter 6 that we then see the city fall. Rahab and her family are saved and drawn into the people of Israel from that point on. In the book of Joshua, there are no other references made to Rahab after her rescue in chapter 6. But there are in the New Testament. There are 3 references. Now, friends, are you with me? I can see a couple of people yawning, so I want to make sure that you're with me. Are you with me? Okay. Let's look at these 3 references really quickly. Matthew chapter 1, verses 5 and onwards. Rahab is mentioned as one of the 5 women mentioned in the genealogy of Matthew, drawing her into the descendancy of Jesus himself. Now think about that. A foreign woman brought into the descendancy of Jesus Christ, Saviour of the Jews only? Hebrews 11. She is listed as one of the champions of faith. If you go through Hebrews 11, it's a fantastic read. There is person after person after person you would recognise if you know anything of your Old Testament. And they are credited for being amazing people of faith. Notably, the only one on the entire list who was not born into Israel is Rahab. And then in James chapter 2, alongside the great Abraham, she is commended. In fact, she is called righteous. The prostitute Rahab is called righteous for her obedience in faith for rescuing the spies. What we see in Rahab is one who does more than simply acknowledge the Lord as God. She acts upon that knowledge. In the first instance, that meant denying her own people with a certain degree of risk in order to stand with the people of God. And in the second instance, it meant doing what was asked of her, so that when that day of judgment came, when Israel came to overthrow Jericho, to bring down the walls, she would be marked as saved. Friends, what we see in Jesus is God's final act of judgment and salvation for all of the nations, for all people. He is in the New Testament the fulfillment of what was promised to Israel and extended to Rahab. Jesus was the one who could accept all, inclusive of who they are, whatever their background, whatever their upbringing might be. He was the one willing to save even the worst of people, and he modelled it. He reached out a hand not only to those of Israel's descendants, as in the Jews, he reached out a hand to those other tribes and nations, to the Roman centurion, to the Canaanite woman, to the Syrophoenician woman, to the Samaritan woman. And you see example after example of when he would walk into territories where he is there so that they would know that they would be saved. But he didn't just want to save people of other nations. He opened his arms to people of all walks of life. Those with evil spirits, those with leprosy or paralyzed, the deaf, the mute, the blind, to the tax collectors, to the beggars, to the prostitutes, to the rich fools, to the adulterers, to the Pharisees, and to the disciples who he then asked to go to all of the nations in his Great Commission. And to the Apostle Paul, a murderer, who, in the first reading we had today from Galatians 1, was commissioned to go to the Gentiles to proclaim the good news as one who had previously been the persecutor of the faith. Okay, so what's the good news that Joshua 2 foreshadows for us today? Let's bring this home. What's the good news that this passage, where does the rubber hit the road for us, and why should we pay any attention to this Old Testament passage? How about I tell you about what it means to me, and then I'm going to ask you to think about that for yourself. If I were reading Joshua 2 back before I became a Christian, when I turned away from what the Bible was saying because I thought it was only for good people, and I knew I probably wasn't one of them, then in looking at Rahab, I would be looking at a woman that God was willing to accept over and above all of those bad things. In Rahab, I would have been able to see that it is possible to approach God and through Jesus to do that without my wrongdoing being held against me, because Jesus was willing to take it for me. And if I were reading Joshua 2 back shortly after I had become a Christian, as a young Christian in some ways, when I tried but yet I stumbled, when I felt inept and useless as a Christian, constantly thinking that I was letting God down and that I should be ashamed of myself. Then in looking at Joshua chapter 2, I would be looking at the spies who seemed to bumble their way through and yet were still under the hand of God. In the spies, I see that being a Christian is not about building the perfect record or achieving some level of status to be impressive or acceptable before God. This passage tells me something of the character and the inclusive nature of God, which is most clearly and ultimately seen in Jesus. And in him calls me to exercise that fallen faith in imperfect obedience. And finally, in reading Joshua 2, as someone who has been a Christian for some time, still falling down at many points, then Joshua 2 and Rahab gives me confidence to know that when I do speak now of a saving faith in Jesus, that it is an offer that I can make to anyone, whatever their background, whatever their sin, whatever their objection, and that the hope of salvation that comes will ultimately come through Jesus. So it means I don't have to melt in fear. I am only asked to walk in faith. I stand under the banner of Christ, safe till the day that he returns to knock down the walls of the world and save all those who know him. And so, friends, whoever you are, wherever you are in that journey of faith, let me ask you, what does Joshua 2 and the account of Rahab do for you?
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.